In 1910, 23-year-old Marcus Garvey set out on a journey through Central America. Supporting himself as a journalist and laborer, Garvey saw black workers harvesting plantations, loading ships, and building the Panama Canal. They were the power behind the economy, but in their isolation from each other, black people were powerless. On July 2nd, 1917, just months after America's entry into World War I, the city of East St. Louis exploded in the worst racial rioting the country had ever seen. 39 whites and hundreds of African Americans were killed.
You have black troops going off to fight to make the world safe for democracy in April, and in July you have black people being murdered in the most wanton and barbaric manner in East St. Louis, you know, children being thrown back into flaming houses, people being boarded up in their houses before they're torched. So even by American standards, East St. Louis was a horror.
The whole thing, my friends, is a bloody farce. That the police and soldiers did nothing to stem the murder thirst of the mob is conclusive proof of conspiracy on the part of the civil authorities to condone the acts of the white mob against Negroes. White people are taking advantage of black men today because black men all over the world are disunited.
It is that speech that marks the turning point of Garvey away from Jamaica, away from a preoccupation with matters related to the West Indies. And now he's not looking for support for what he is hoping to accomplish in the West Indies, but rather he is now sucked into the vortex of American race relations.
In 1914, while in Jamaica, Garvey organized the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, to build up racial pride and develop educational and economic opportunities for blacks.
He had these high aspirations for building this universal, this worldwide organization to empower people of African descent.
2 years later, Garvey came to the United States and established the UNIA in New York City's Harlem.
There were at least 700 chapters of the UNIA in the United States by 1921 through 1924.
And all of a sudden, this golden voice from the Caribbean came and stood on the corners in Harlem and began to talk about self-esteem, holding up your backbone, you know, no wishbones. And Mr. Garvey gave them hope that there was a dream for black people.
Garvey told black Americans that their history did not begin with slavery. Africa's glorious past was also theirs to claim, he said, and people who had once done great things could do them again.
Garvey's message was revolutionary because at that time, it told black people that they had to unite. They had to come together as one and believe in their roots, that they came from something greater than they were told.
And of the members working for the UNIA, 2 of these Garveyites will become the parents of Malcolm X.
Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. You should ask yourself who taught you to hate being what God gave you.
The ancestor fondly remembered as Malcolm X was known by many names, titles, and attributes, such as Malcolm Little, Detroit Red, Brother Malcolm, Hajj Malik Shabazz, Omowale, and others. In this video, we want to highlight the origins of the ancestor Malcolm as he became known as Omowale, and how, even before his birth, he was destined to be a warrior for Black people and justice worldwide. The ancestor was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in the city of Omaha, Nebraska. This story is about Malcolm, more so the origins of Malcolm, arguably the most famous person from the state of Nebraska. And so, we begin our story in Omaha with his parents, Earl and Louise Little. Many people familiar with Malcolm's origin are aware that his father, Earl Little, was a Christian reverend. Reverend Little was originally from Reynolds, Georgia. He moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where he fathered 3 children with his wife at that time. After moving to Philadelphia, he met Louise. She was originally from Grenada and was the product of a forced tragic arrangement, meaning her father was a suspected white supremacist who had forced himself on her mother, resulting in the ancestor Louise being born very pale. Sometimes she could even pass as white. As a victim of racism, this could be problematic for many reasons. Earl and Louise Little had their first child in Philadelphia, but moved to Nebraska shortly after. Reverend Little, who was inspired by the work and teachings of the ancestor, the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and the principles of freedom, independence, and self-respect for Black people, he became a supporter of Garvey's famous Back to Africa movement. The Littles established and ran the Omaha chapter of the UNIA. Omaha, around this time, had many instances of white terrorism against Black victims of white supremacy, as well as acts of counter-violence by Black people attempting to defend themselves. One incident of note was the lynching of Will Brown in 1919, where white residents of Omaha tore apart and set fire to the county jail, had shootouts with law enforcement agents, and even attempted to lynch the mayor in an effort to pull Will Brown, who was accused of assaulting a white female, from his jail cell to be executed before he could ever go to trial and attempt to prove his innocence. Any Black person who came within the area was also savagely beaten. Following the lynching of Will Brown, more battles between the white residents and their Black victims continued until the National Guard was finally called in. Such incidents of battles within the global race war continued in Omaha, as it has been in countless other places until today. In the midst of the white terrorism in Omaha at the time, Earl and Louise Little were active in their parts to replace the system of white supremacy with a system of justice the best way they knew how. These efforts led to much mistreatment at the hands of overt white supremacists, such as the Ku Klux Klan, who terrorized the Littles into leaving Omaha and Nebraska once and for all, briefly moving to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and eventually settling in Lansing, Michigan. Reverend Earl Little and his wife, Louise, continued their teaching and practice of the Garveyite principles. White residents in Lansing responded by sending members of the overt white supremacist group, the Black Legion, to terrorize the Littles. Their house was burned to the ground. Ultimately, Earl Little was assassinated. Little Malcolm and his siblings had lost their father, as well as 5 of his 6 brothers, to violence at the hands of white men practicing racism. Louise Little appeared to have had visions, premonitions of sorts, about the coming death of her husband. She pleaded and argued with him, but Earl Little continued on, facing whatever was to come. Such bravery not only left a mark on Little Malcolm, but will also be reflected in Malcolm's own final days, years later. Without Reverend Little alive to provide and protect, Louise Little was left alone with 8 children to provide for. The Littles did have life insurance on the Reverend, but only the smaller of the 2 policies they had actually paid out. The larger policy never paid out, as the insurance company claimed the Reverend had killed himself, even though the back of his head had been bashed in and he had been found on train tracks nearly cut in half. Louise Little was eventually forced to provide domestic services for white people in order to make ends meet, White people in Lansing at the time did not want so-called Negroes in their homes, but because she was so pale, Louise Little was able to pass as white in order to get work. Even this wasn't enough to provide, even though she worked hard and even received welfare. Little Malcolm, as with some of his siblings, began to ditch school and started stealing food to compensate for the lack of food at home. With the lessons of pride and principles deteriorating around him, 9-year-old Malcolm began his introduction into criminal life. The pressures of racism and poverty eventually tore Malcolm's family apart. After social services agents exploited their financial and social plight, Malcolm and his siblings were taken from his mother and thrown into foster care. Separated from his mother and siblings, little Malcolm eventually found himself a ward of the state in a so-called reform home under the charge of white people who treated him more like a pet or a mascot than a human being. In 7th grade, he was even elected class president at the nearly all-white school he was forced to attend. Over the next few years, Malcolm and his siblings stayed in touch the best they could and would sometimes visit his mother, who had been locked away in a mental facility. Malcolm, having been expelled from previous schools, was now one of the few black people in the town of Mason, Michigan, just outside of Lansing. Being placed in the situation he was, a major impact on Malcolm being able to retain some sense of black self-respect was his older sister, Ella, who was as melanin enriched as his father, Reverend Earl, had been, and unlike many victims of racism in Lansing at the time, felt no shame about her complexion. Ella, Reverend Earl's daughter from his first marriage, exemplified the teachings and principles of their father quite well. She had become a shop owner and a property owner. This practice of self-reliance and self-sufficiency allowed Ella to provide for bringing many of their relatives from Georgia out of the South and into the North, where there were much better opportunities for so-called Negroes at the time. When little Malcolm had become a teen, Ella made way for Malcolm to move from Lansing, Michigan to Boston, where she lived. After dropping out of school in the 8th grade, fed up with the acts of white supremacy he endured from his teachers and classmates, Malcolm attempted to find whatever work he could. He also began to grow into a young adult, drinking, smoking, modeling the habits of his surroundings, wearing zoot suits, chemically straightening his hair, and such. Eventually, he went from a shoeshine boy in Boston known as Red to a hustler in Harlem known as Detroit Red. Malcolm's attraction to the street life led him to eventually using and selling drugs as well as robbing, which landed him in prison, where he was first introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. After leaving prison, Malcolm returned to Detroit and joined the Nation of Islam. The teachings of the NOI indeed filled the void for black self-respect and knowledge of self that Malcolm was needing. He had become devoted to exemplifying his faith and principles through practice. Elijah Muhammad, whom Malcolm had come to idolize, had accepted him into the nation, giving him the responsibilities of being a minister within the nation, as well as bestowing upon him the title of X. Malcolm X grew in popularity as he devoted his time and energy to spreading the message and presence of the Nation of Islam throughout the United States concept. With this rise in popularity around the world came envy and jealousy of those closest to the messenger, Elijah Muhammad. Conflict within Malcolm would arise during the Civil Rights Movement, as Malcolm would speak on matters of injustice that adversely affected non-Muslim black people, which placed him at odds with his teacher and idol. For Malcolm, this Pan-African influenced spirit of black self-respect would shine through, even to his detriment. For instance, Malcolm would speak out against instances of police brutality, even after being instructed to leave such things to those black Christians of the Civil Rights Movement. Malcolm and Elijah Muhammad suffered a falling out, resulting in Malcolm first being silenced and then heartbrokenly leaving the nation. As Malcolm had become so prominent a figure, not just as a minister of the nation, but as a devout Muslim and a promoter of justice before the world. When the doors of the nation closed, doors to other opportunities to fulfill his destiny opened. Being separated from the organizational structure of the black and African-based ideology that separated the Nation of Islam from the rest of the Muslim world, Malcolm was now free to represent Islam as he saw appropriate. He began his own temple organization, Muslim Mosque Incorporated. But importantly, he needed to realign himself spiritually. To achieve this, he decided it was time to take his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, the heart of the Muslim world. During his pilgrimage, Malcolm found the realignment he needed as a devoted practitioner of Islam. The culture shock he received, sitting, eating, and praying with even white Muslims, had Malcolm convinced more than ever that Islam could be the salvation for white people from their religion of white supremacy, and that Islam was the cure to racism. Malcolm also became more convinced than ever that Orthodox Islam would be a salvation for the Nation of Islam. He was made to feel accepted, not as an American and not as a black person, but as a Muslim. It was on his pilgrimage to Mecca that Malcolm X received the title Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. Many focus on Malcolm's trip to Mecca, but overlook his visits to Africa. It is this other pilgrimage that needs to be highlighted.
From the seat of his self-styled empire in Harlem, Marcus Garvey argued that it was time to give Africa back to black people. Some said it was a ridiculous fantasy, but Garvey's slogan, Africa for the Africans, reverberated around the world as his movement spread through the colonies. In Europe, Garvey began to be seen as a threat.
The United States had worked with the British government during World War I, and they continued that after World War I with a focus on Garvey. Because the British government was deathly afraid that the Garvey movement was going to spread revolution. They feared the hundreds of thousands of the masses of blacks under his influence.
Why should the black man in America concern himself, since we've been away from the African continent for 400 years, 300 or 400 years? Why should we concern ourselves? What impact does what happened to them have upon us? Number one, first you have to realize that up until 1959, Africa was dominated by the colonial powers, and by the colonial powers of Europe having complete control over Africa, they projected the image of Africa negatively. They projected Africa always in a negative light. Jungles, savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. And naturally, it was so negative until it was negative to you and me. And you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody to tell us anything about Africa, and much less call us an African. And in hating Africa and hating the African, we ended up even hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. You can't hate Africa and not hate yourself. And you show me one of these people over here who have been thoroughly brainwashed, who has a negative attitude toward Africa, and I'll show you one that has a negative attitude toward himself. You can't have a negative attitude toward yourself, a positive attitude toward yourself, and a negative attitude toward Africa at the same time. To the same degree that your attitude, that your understanding of an attitude toward Africa becomes positive, you'll find that your understanding of and your attitude toward yourself will also become positive. And this is what the white man knows. So they very skillfully made you and me hate our African identity, our African characteristics. And you know yourself that we have been a people who hated our African characteristics. We hated our hair. We hated the shape of our nose. We wanted one of those long dog-like noses, you know. Yeah. We hated the color of our skin. Hated the blood of Africa that was in our veins. And in hating our features and our skin and our blood, why we had to end up hating ourselves. And we hated ourselves. Our color became to us a chain. We felt that it was holding us back. Our color became to us like a prison, which we felt was keeping us confined, not letting us go this way or that way. And we felt that all of these restrictions were based solely upon our color, and the psychological reaction to that would have to be that as long as we felt imprisoned or chained or trapped by black skin, black features, and black blood, that skin and those features and that blood that was holding us back automatically had to become hateful to us. And it became hateful to us. It made us feel inferior. It made us feel inadequate. It made us feel helpless. And when we fell victim to this feeling of inadequacy or inferiority or helplessness, we turned to somebody else to show us the way. We didn't have confidence in another black man to show us the way, or black people to show us the way. In those days, we didn't. We didn't think a black man could do anything. but play some horn, you know, some sounds, and make you happy with some songs, and in that way. In serious things, where our food, clothing, and shelter was concerned, and our education was concerned, we turned to the man. We never thought in terms of bringing these things into existence for ourselves. We never thought in terms of doing things for ourselves because we felt helpless. And what made us feel helpless was our hatred for ourselves. One of the things that made the black Muslim movement grow was its emphasis upon things African. This was the secret to the growth of the black Muslim movement. African blood, African origin, African culture, African ties. And you'd be surprised. We discovered that deep within the subconscious of the black man in this country, he's still more African than he is American. He thinks that he's more American than African because the man is jiving him and the man is brainwashing him every day, telling him, you're an American, you're an American. Man, how could you think you're an American and you have never had any kind of American treat over here? You have never. 10 men can be sitting at a table, eating, you know, dining. And I can come and sit down where they're dining. They're dining. I got a plate in front of me, but nothing is on it. Because all of us are sitting at the same table, are all of us diners? I'm not a diner until you let me dine. Then I become a diner. Just being at the table with others who are dining doesn't make me a diner. And this is what you got to get in your head here in this country. Just because you're in this country doesn't make you an American. And no, you got to go farther than that before you can become an American. You got to enjoy the fruits of Americanism. And you haven't enjoyed those fruits. You've enjoyed the thorns. You've enjoyed the thistles, but you have not enjoyed the fruits. No, sir. So I point these things out, brothers and sisters, so that you and I will know the importance in 1965 of being in complete unity with each other, harmony with each other, and not letting the man maneuver us into fighting one another. I say that again that I'm not a racist. I don't believe in any form of segregation or anything like that. I'm for the brotherhood of everybody, but I don't believe in forcing brotherhood upon people who don't want it. As long as we practice brotherhood among ourselves, and then others who want to practice brotherhood with us, we practice it with them also, we're for that. But I don't think that we should run around trying to love somebody who doesn't love us. Thank you.
Undoubtedly, Garvey did stir up nationalism.
I say this plainly and for everybody to hear. We are organizing to drive every pale face out of Africa. Do you know why? Because Africa is mine. Africa is the land of my fathers. We who make up this organization know no turning back. We have pledged ourselves even unto the last drop of our sacred blood that Africa must be free.
Garvey's Negro World, now published in Spanish, French, and English, carried news of rebellion around the world. In Africa and the Caribbean, colonial authorities banned the newspaper. But with over 500 divisions of the UNIA in 22 countries, Garvey's message could not be stopped.
The Negro World was being smuggled into Kenya by seamen, black seamen, and then it would be read aloud to groups of people around this reader, plus young children, young boys in particular, who were charged with memorizing Garvey's editorial in the Negro World. So it would read out, and then these young boys would run off, having memorized it, run off to the villages and spread Garvey's word in that way.
On August 1st, 1920, thousands of UNIA delegates from 25 countries assembled at Liberty Hall and Madison Square Garden. Garvey called it the International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World. He hoped to move a step closer to his dream of a black nation in Africa, with himself at the helm.
We have met in this historic building tonight for the purpose of enlightening the world respecting the attitude of the new Negro. If you believe that the Negro should have a place in the sun, if you believe that Africa should be one vast empire controlled by the Negro, then arise and sing the national anthem of the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
when he finally took to the stage, it was Garvey's moment of greatest triumph.
25,000 people, black people, packed Madison Square Garden, and Garvey delivers this magnificent speech in which he tells the Europeans to give Africa a wide berth because we are coming home.
Many focus on Malcolm's trip to Mecca, but overlook his visits to Africa. It is this other pilgrimage that needs to be highlighted. His pilgrimage was not just to the Muslim world, but to return to his so-called African roots. After making a quick detour to speak at the University of Beirut about the plight of black people in the so-called United States, Malcolm finally made it to Nigeria. In Lagos, he spoke at Ibadan University of the need for so-called Afro-Americans to spiritually return to Africa and adopt a Pan-African framework for the unity of black people around the world. At the Students' Union, the Nigerian Muslim Student Society made Malcolm X, newly titled Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, an honorary member of their society, bestowing upon him the calling Omowale, a Yoruba title meaning the son who has come home. In his autobiography, as told to Alex Haley, Malcolm Omowale Shabazz is quoted speaking of receiving membership in the Student Society and receiving the calling of Omowale, saying, "I meant it when I told them I had never received a more treasured honor." In a sense, Omowale's pilgrimage to Africa was an honoring of the life and legacy of his mother Louise and father Reverend Earl Little. He had come full circle, returning to the teachings that guided his family from the moment he entered this world. After Lagos, Omowale flew to Ghana, landing in Accra. He was prepared for more speaking engagements as well as meeting with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first elected president and famed Pan-African. It was in Ghana, the fountainhead of Pan-Africanism, that Omowale recharged his determination to make things difficult for those who practice white supremacy on his fellow victims of racism in the so-called United States. It was also in Ghana that he recognized that he was no longer Malcolm, the American Muslim Negro, but he had become a symbol for the fight against racial oppression and a hope for justice around the world. After leaving Ghana, Omowale visited Liberia, Senegal, Morocco, and Algeria before heading back to New York. Malcolm X returned to tell the world that black people's issues were not merely issues of civil rights, but of human rights, and that he planned to present his case against the United States to the United Nations. Having his position recognized, accepted, and supported by so many victims of racism on a global level, coupled with his desire to work with anyone who wished to produce constructive results, including those he had previously not seen eye to eye with, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and others like John Henry Clark, with whom he formed the Organization for Afro-American Unity. This made Omowale a bigger threat and target for his rivals and enemies. By embracing other victims of racism to focus on replacing white supremacy with justice, no matter the differences between himself and those other victims, demonstrated one of the highest levels of black self-respect. According to the code, Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. suggests that conflict between wars should be avoided or minimized at all costs, and that victims of racism should only come into contact with one another when the focus is being constructive, when the focus is replacing the system of white supremacy, racism, with a system of justice. Embracing this strategy into his own code, combined with his prominence on a global level and determination to hold white people accountable, made Omowale, Malcolm X, one of the most dangerous people in the world in the eyes of those who practice white supremacy. On February 21st, 1965, the ancestor was assassinated in front of his wife Betty and their daughters by black gunmen suspected of working for and with members of the various law enforcement agencies. Those white people in power had used the racist strategy referred to in the code as racial shadowboxing, thus ending the physical life of Malcolm X, making him a martyr before the world. As an ancestor, Omowale is seen as a symbol of sacred black masculinity, bravery, and attempted counter-racism. The legacy of the ancestor Malcolm Omowale Shabazz, or El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, can be seen in those whom he inspired, including the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the ancestor John Africa and the organization MOVE, the Republic of New Africa, as well as individuals such as his wife, the ancestor Dr. Betty Shabazz, his daughters, including Ilyasa, Atala, Gamila, Kubila, Malak, and the late Malika Shabazz, the ancestors Muhammad Ali, Dr. John Henrik Clark, Dr. Yosef Ben Yekinen, and countless others who were inspired by the life and teachings of Malcolm X, as well as those they inspired. For this, I personally think the ancestor Malcolm Omowale Shabazz deserves to be remembered. I think it is worth noting that in 2022, after many efforts on the part of Black residents of Nebraska, especially those in Omaha, and against the efforts of many suspected white supremacists, Malcolm X was chosen to be inducted into the Nebraska State Hall of Fame. He is the first and only Black person, thus far, to receive this recognition.
The 13th, they put me on a plane to get me to Algiers, and I had, to show you what a small world this is, I had breakfast in Conakry on Friday the 13th, and had lunch in Dakar in Senegal, and dinner that evening in Geneva, went to bed that night in Paris, and was in Algiers the next morning at 10 o'clock. So when the man made these airplanes for you and me, he made them so we could get around and let our brothers know what's happening. So, brothers and sisters, I tell you that to let you know that in all of the traveling that I did in the Middle East and in Africa, everywhere I went, I found nothing but open minds. I found nothing but open hearts. And I found nothing but open doors. Our people love us. All they want to know is, do we love them? While I was traveling, I had an opportunity to speak with President Nasser when I was in Egypt. I also had an opportunity to speak with President Nyeri for 3 hours while I was in Dar es Salaam. He's a most intelligent man and alert and knows what's going on. President Nasser is too, most alert, knows what's going on. I also, when I was in Nigeria, had a chance to speak with President Azikwe in Lagos, and President Nkrumah, who stays up to date. He can tell you so much about what's happening in Harlem, you think he's out there on the corner with us. And you can quickly see why this man doesn't like him. He's hip to him, brother.
Okay. So, you're welcome to Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park. This park was established in the year 1992 to honor the life and legacy of Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first Prime Minister and President. Yes, Osajifo is a title, and it means a savior, a warrior, or a redeemer. Yeah. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was born on 21st September 1909 at a village called Nkrofo in the western part of Ghana. His parents were Mr. Kwame Nkrumah and Madam Elizabeth Nyaneba. He had his elementary education in a Roman Catholic school in Nkrofo. Then he enrolled in the Achimota College, now Achimota Senior High School here in Accra, where he had a 4-year teacher training course. From there, he taught as a pupil teacher in the Catholic schools across the Gold Coast. So Ghana was formerly known as the Gold Coast. In 1935, he was awarded a scholarship to study at the Lincoln University in the USA, where he read economics and sociology for his first degree.
At the age of 26, Nkrumah left the Gold Coast to study at Lincoln University in the USA. He read widely from the literature of Karl Marx and Marcus Garvey. And from then on, ideals of socialism became appealing to him.
Nkrumah was very much inspired by Marcus Garvey and the whole idea of return to Africa and black freedom. That inspired him a lot too. So he knew about all those things. That would have fueled his ideas for a kind of Pan-African consciousness and the need to rally a wide range of people in pursuit of what he wanted.
In the United States of America, he came across, writings of George Padmore and co, who were in the Pan-African movement, W.E. Du Bois and all. And eventually in 1945, he linked up with them in Manchester, United Kingdom, where they organized the 5th Pan-African Congress. And they decided to accelerate the struggle for liberation of Africa.
As men of thought and action, they exerted great influence on the young Nkrumah. His ideas for the unity of all Africans later came to be known as Pan-Africanism. In his book, I Speak of Freedom, Nkrumah wrote, "Divided we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good in the world."
He then continued to the University of Pennsylvania and over there studied philosophy for his master's. Whilst abroad, he developed interest in Pan-African politics. He later enrolled in the London School of Economics, but left after a semester to pursue his political career and Pan-Africanist ambition. In 1947, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was invited to join the United Gold Coast Convention, the UGCC, which happened to be the first and active political party to be formed here in the Gold Coast. He was made the General Secretary of the UGCC, and he, together with the other leaders of the UGCC, formed a group of people popularly known as the Big Six. And they're the people whose faces have been printed on the Ghanaian currency notes. But whilst in the UGCC, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah realized his vision and ideology didn't align with that of the UGCC, because the UGCC sought for self-government in the shortest possible time, whereas he as an individual wanted immediate self-government. So in 1949, 2 years after joining the UGCC, he left to form his own political party called the Convention's People's Party, or the CPP. And the slogan for the CPP was self-government now. After forming the CPP, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah organized a campaign. It was called the Positive Action Campaign. The campaign resulted in strikes and demonstrations, and that didn't sit well with the British administration. As a result, he, being the leader of the campaign, was arrested, sent to the James Fort prison to be detained for 3 years. But whilst in prison, the 1951 general elections, which happened to be the first ever to be held in the Gold Coast, was drawing near, and Dr. Kwame Nkrumah took a bold step of contesting whilst in prison. He was made to contest, but they didn't think he was in any way going to win the elections. But to their surprise, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah won the 1951 general elections, and they had no other option than to release him and make him the leader of government business. In 1952, he became the first Prime Minister of the Gold Coast, and on 6th March 1957, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, together with the leading members of the CPP, stood over there where the statue has been mounted to declare Ghana's independence. So this park is also known as the Old Polo Grounds, or the Old Polo Park, where the British used to play the polo game. At the time, no black or African was given access here. So Dr. Kwame Nkrumah wanted to make a statement and prove that indeed we have freedom, invited the Gold Coasters and made the Independence Declaration. So that was where he stood when he said in his speech, "At long last, the battle has ended. Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever." So on that day, the name changed from Gold Coast to Ghana, which means a warrior king. Ghana? Yeah.
Awesome. We are going to say that we create our own African personality and identity. We dedicate ourselves not only in the struggle to emancipate all the territories in Africa. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total reflection of the African continent.
And let the band play our national anthem. And from now on, that national anthem is the national anthem of the Gogo to be played on all occasions.
The mood was electrified. Everybody was seeing the dawn of a new beginning. This was the day on which he said that the African was capable of governing himself. And he said that we as Africans should be allowed to make our own mistakes. That was an incredible day.
Its freedom served as an inspiration to other African countries struggling against colonial rule, and as a result, Ghana occupied a central role in the fight against imperialists.
In December that same year, 1957, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah got married to an Egyptian woman. Her name was Fathia Rist. It was a politically arranged marriage to serve as a means of bringing all African countries together so as to push his Pan-Africanist agenda. But before he got married to Fathia, he had a son in 1935 with a British Ghanaian woman called Fanny Henrietta Miller. The child's name was Professor Dr. Francis Nkrumah. He died 2 months ago at 89 years of age. With Fathia, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah had 3 children, and their names are Gamal, Samia, and Sekou. So in all, he had 4 children, 3 of them are still alive. On 1st July 1960, Ghana became a republic, and on that day, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was sworn in as the first president of the Republic of Ghana. He was a president for 6 years. In the month of February 1966, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was invited to Vietnam on a peace mission.
By declaring Ghana a one-party state, he was perceived as a dictator.
So with a one-party system, everything became all Nkrumah, and that was wrong.
But you see, that again is a total misunderstanding of African history. Almost all of the African states which broke away from the colonial yoke established one-party states.
I waited one day when it was a good mood alone. Then I said, why do you want a one-party state? Then he said, you know, I've established so many industries and institutions, and I don't have enough competent people to man them. Many of the people who can do this are in the opposition. And that was why later I found the only way out was to have a one-party state, so we all belong.
The other thing which I won't necessarily say anti-Nkrumah, okay, but they say that he was too intolerant and not democratic and impatient, and you know they cite example that Mandela had the same fate. He went in for 27 years, came back and was hailed, but there was no way Nkrumah was going to take it lying down, and that made him too oppressive.
I totally disagree, because you see, from the 60s, in fact, as early as 1963, he started this industrialization program. And don't forget that every project that Nkrumah tackled was resisted. The motorway was resisted, and people jubilated because the motorway was truncated, because they get the false alarm. The hydroelectric dam itself was opposed in Parliament. I remember I've forgotten the name of the person who was leading it. Every Tema Harbor, all the projects were opposed. But because of his own exposure in the United States, he knew the benefits of these projects, so that he persisted to make sure that the projects were implemented. And definitely he did cultivate some misunderstanding, enemy, but those who were hoping that these programs virtually did not survive.
Could he have done more in terms of, I don't know if educating or sensitizing or letting the people know that they needed it, rather than, you don't know you need it, so just come along with me? Because it feels that the reason why everybody will oppose is that, I come in here and say, that's a pint of blood, you need it, without me telling you that you are anemic.
You see, that's what I'm saying, that it was a truncation. Don't forget that he sent virtually hundreds of people to universities outside in those days. The program had actually started in 1960, but 61, the first batch, for instance, we went by about 80-something. And these people who had been conscious and who really understood the programs, could not come back before the coup took place. And those forces against were aware that if these people came back with the right knowledge, with the explanation, etc., they would not succeed in their attempt to overthrow him. So They just made sure that the people with the right knowledge and understanding did not, could not take power before he was overthrown.
Whilst he was away, a coup d'etat was staged here in Ghana by a group of police and military men led by Kotoka, a free-fine IGP Hali, with the indirect influence of the CIA to overthrow him. When he heard the news of his overthrow, for fear of his life, he didn't return to Ghana and went into exile in Guinea-Conakry. Over there in Guinea, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was made co-president by Ahmed Sékou Touré, who was the then Guinea president. So he was there in Guinea as a co-president for 5 years, from 1966 till October 1971, where he fell sick and was sent to Romania for treatment, where he died of prostate cancer on 27 April 1972 at the Bucharest hospital in Romania at 63 years of age. His body was then sent to Guinea, where he was given a state burial, and that lasted for 3 months. At the time of his death, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's mother was alive. She was 100 years old at the time and blind due to old age. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was her only child as well. So she, together with some relatives, pleaded for the body because initially Sékou Touré didn't want to bring the body to Ghanaians, because if he had overthrown him, why want his body after his death? So because of his mother's pleadings or pleas, he allowed the body to be embalmed, put in a metallic coffin, and sent to his hometown in Crawford, which is in the western region of Ghana. And over there, the body was put on public display for 20 years. Wow. When this park was built in his honor in the year 1992, his body was brought here, but they realized it was decaying and didn't look too pleasant. As a result, it was transferred into a wooden coffin to preserve the metallic one, and the body has been buried in the mausoleum, that structure over there. Yeah. Any questions? So where we are heading towards with the statue ahead of us is called the Declaration Grounds. And this was where Dr. Kwame Nkrumah stood together with the leading members of the CPP to declare Ghana's independence on 6th March 1957. The statue we are seeing was inspired by one of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's quotes, or a statement he made. And what he said was, "We face neither east nor west, we face forward." In simple terms, this quote also means forward ever, backwards never. So when we look at the side of the park, we see statues. These statues are known as horn blowers. In our traditional settings, they blow the horns announce the presence of prominent people like chiefs. But in this case, their role is to announce the death of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. When we look at the far left, there's a statue playing the traditional drums. Can you see it? That represents the southern sector of Ghana. And there's another one on the far right in smoke playing something like a guitar. That represents the northern sector, and they both symbolize unity and also show Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's belief and support for cultural diversity. So we head into the mausoleum. Okay, so this structure is the mausoleum, and that's where Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and his wife Fathia have been buried. The mausoleum was designed by a Ghanaian architect called Dr. Don Arthur. He designed it like a truncated tree, or a tree that has been cut short to represent the unfinished works of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. The mausoleum was also designed like the state sword that has been turned upside down. So this part we see is the handle of the sword. A sword that has been turned upside down symbolizes peace in the Akan language. So in other words, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah has been laid to rest under the tree of peace, and the black star at the top represents hope for Ghana as well as the African continent. Let's go in there. Okay, so this here is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's third burial place. His first burial took place in Guinea-Conakry, the second his hometown, and this is his third. And over there is where his wife Fathia has been buried. Yes, the Egyptian. Fathia died in the year 2007, but before she died, she made a request to be buried beside her husband. So her body was then brought from Egypt to be buried over here. Also, the water around the mausoleum, as we know, water is life, meaning though he's dead, his legacy still lives on. Okay, so this broken statue we are seeing was once a complete statue of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and it used to be mounted at the old Parliament House, and that's the building across the park. During the 1966 coup to overthrow Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, properties including statues of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah across the country were destroyed. With this very statue, the head was removed and it was said the dictator had been taken off. One of the reasons that led to his overthrow was Dr. Kwame Nkrumah wanted to be a life president and wanted Ghana to be a one-party state. As a result, he was seen as autocratic. Also, due to his Pan-Africanist ambition, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was helping other African countries develop by giving them Ghana's resources, and that looked as though he was neglecting the needs of the Ghanaian people. So when he was sent to Vietnam, they took that opportunity and overthrew him. This part of the statue was recovered right after the coup, but the head was found in the year 2009, 43 years after the coup. It was returned by a woman on an anonymous note. She did so because after the coup, if you were caught possessing anything that represented or stood for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, it meant you were against the military regime and you served as a threat. So you could either be arrested or killed. So as a result of that fear, whilst returning the head of the statue, she didn't disclose any information about herself, not even her name. So this place is called the Freedom Wall. On the wall are portraits of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah displaying varied emotions, like being angry, being indifferent or sad, smiling and laughing. They represent the stages he went through to gain Ghana's independence, and this display of emotions reveals his human nature as well. Also on the wall is his favorite quote, which says that, "I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me." And the black star once again represents hope for Ghana as well as the African continent. This brings us to the end of our talk. Thank you very much. Emilia.
Thank you, Emilia.
You're welcome.
When a person when a person places the proper value upon freedom, there is nothing under the sun he will not do to acquire that freedom. Whenever you hear a man saying he wants freedom, but in the next breath he's going to tell you what he won't do to get it, or what he doesn't believe in doing in order to get it, he doesn't believe in freedom. A man who believes in freedom will do anything under the sun or achieve his freedom, and he will do anything under the sun to preserve his freedom. And the only reason you and I here in America don't yet have freedom is we haven't yet matured to that stage so that we can see this is the real price or the real attitude or the real approach that one must make. I was in, as I say, Cairo for, not just Cairo, but Egypt, the United Arab Republic for 2 months, and then left and went to Mecca, where I was for about a week. I was in Saudi Arabia for about a week, in Mecca a couple of days, and left there and went to Kuwait, where all the oil is, on the Persian Sea, and from there to Beirut in Lebanon. And after spending 2 months there in the Middle East, then I went on into Africa, the first stop, into other parts of Africa, I should say, the first stop being Khartoum, where since they've had a whole lot of trouble, which they should have had. Now everything is all settled. They had a revolution and got people that didn't belong in power out of power. That's how you do it. And that's what they did, the students. The students all over the world are the ones who bring about a change. Old people don't bring about a change. I mean, I'm not saying this against anybody that's old, because if you're ready for some action, you're not old. I don't care how old you are. But if you're not ready for some action, I don't care how young you are, you're old. As long as you want some action, you're young. But anytime you begin to sit on the fence and your toes start shaking because you're afraid too much action is going down, then you're too old. You need to get on out of the way. Some of us get too old while we're still in our teens. So I went through Khartoum to Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, which is a wonderful country. It has its problems, and it's still a wonderful country. Some of the most beautiful people I've seen are in Ethiopia, and most intelligent, and most dignified are right there in Ethiopia. You hear all kinds of propaganda about Ethiopia. But anytime a person tries to tell you, as they told you and me, that Ethiopians don't think they're the same as we are, that's some of that man's manufacturing. He made that up. You know who I mean when I say that man. They're just as friendly toward us as anybody else is. I was there for about a week, and went on into Kenya, a place which really knocked me out. If ever I saw any Africans who look like they have the potential for explosion, it's our good Kikuyu brothers in Kenya. And you know, I was discussing my opinion of the people of Kenya, especially in Nairobi, with some friends while I was there. And I told them that I just look in the faces of these people, they look like they can explode. And they do. They look like they can explode. More so than any place I went on the continent. You can just see right in their faces. Energy. Now, if you channel it in the wrong direction, the right direction, it goes in the right direction. If you let it go in the wrong direction, it goes in the wrong direction. But they got the energy. That's the most important thing. And proof of which they can explode. They exploded the other day. When the United States with her criminal action in the Congo, and that's what it is, criminal action in the Congo. They marched on the embassy there in Nairobi, tore it up. And that shows you what the Africans feel. They don't like to see anybody exploiting another African or oppressing another African. They stick together. And you and I can learn that's what we're supposed to do. When something happened in Mississippi, we don't have to go to Mississippi. They got some people look just like those in Mississippi right here. And my contention is those up here are just as much responsible for what's happening down there as those down there. And when you and I let them know that we hold all of them responsible, then all of them will start acting right. They'll keep those others in line. But as long as you and I make them think they can pass the buck, then they'll be passing the buck. They'll be telling us, you know, Mississippi, and they're doing the same thing right here. So when I left Kenya, I went to Zanzibar and Tanganyika. Now it's called Tanzania. And I never went anywhere that pleased me more than that place. It's a beautiful, all of Africa is beautiful. But in Tanganyika, it's a very beautiful place. It's hot, but it's like Miami. Miami is hot. And if these people pay as much money as they do to live in Miami, well, you know, the entire African continent where I went looked just like Miami Beach. And they're always telling you and me, you know, how difficult a time we would have trying to adjust if we went over there. And I'm telling you, if you want to integrate, go to Africa. There's more white people over there than there are over here. That's where they all are. They're over there living like kings. Sure, basking in the sun. When I left Tanganyika, I went back to Kenya, and from Kenya back to Ethiopia, and from Ethiopia to Nigeria, which is another beautiful land, but it's in West Africa. I was there for several days, and then went to Ghana, and from Ghana to Liberia, and from Liberia to Guinea, Conakry, a most beautiful country. You've got one of the best presidents on the African continent. And then from there to Algeria. In fact, I missed my plane I was supposed to go directly from Conakry via Bamako to Algiers by aeroflot, and I missed it, and not to my own doing. The airplane company didn't give me the right information. They said that the plane left at 11:55. I got to the airport at 11 o'clock, and they told me that it left at 8 o'clock that morning. I talked to them in 4 languages. So on Friday the 13th, they put me on a plane to get me to Algiers, and I had, to show you what a small world this is, I had breakfast in Conakry on Friday the 13th, and had lunch in Dakar in Senegal, and dinner that evening in Geneva, and went to bed that night in Paris, and was in Algiers the next morning at 10 o'clock. So when the man made these airplanes for you and me, he made them so we could get around and let our brothers know what's happening. So, brothers and sisters, I tell you that to let you know that in all of the traveling that I did in the Middle East and in Africa,
Everywhere I went, I found nothing but open minds. I found nothing but open hearts. And I found nothing but open doors. Our people love us. All they want to know is, do we love them?